September 6, 2024. Concord's servers went dark. The game had been on sale for 14 days. Sony refunded every purchase, every PlayStation 5 copy, every Steam copy. The studio that built it had 172 employees. Within 8 weeks, none of them would have a job. Welcome to the final save. Dava crate time equals 0 times 7s. This is the story of a hero shooter that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build, launched into a market it had studied for years, and still managed to miss everything that mattered. It is not a story about incompetence. It is a story about what happens when conviction becomes a blindfold, and no one with enough distance from the problem also has enough power to remove it. Ryan Ellis left Bungie in 2017. He had spent years as the creative director on Destiny 2, one of the most successful shared-world shooters ever built. He left with experience, with credibility, and with an idea. Not a pitch document, an idea. In 2018, Ellis co-founded Firewalk Studios in Bellevue, Washington. Joining him were Tony Hsu, a former Activision senior vice president who had served as general manager of the Destiny IP, and Elena Sigmund, a former Bungie producer. 3 people with real credentials. 3 people who had watched a major live service game succeed from the inside. The project had no name, no publisher. Probably Monsters, the game's incubation company that housed Firewalk, announced an $18 million seed round in 2019. Hiring started. The team grew. The genre they were building toward was already established. Overwatch had launched in 2016. By the time Firewalk was in full hiring mode, hero shooters were defined territory with dominant players who had spent years entrenching their audiences. Firewalk believed it was building something distinct enough to compete. The market would decide whether that belief was correct. April 2021. Sony Interactive Entertainment signed a publishing deal with Probably Monsters for Firewalk's first game, an unannounced AAA multiplayer title for PlayStation 5. Sony was not yet the owner, just the publisher, but money began moving in volume. By the time the game reached alpha, Sony had reportedly committed $200 million. 2 sources told Kotaku that directly. A separate claim from the Sacred Symbols podcast, attributed to an anonymous Concord developer, put the total figure at $400 million, covering both the pre-Sony investment by Probably Monsters and Sony's additional spend from acquisition through launch. Christopher Dring at GI Biz publicly disputed the $400 million, calling it implausible for any game and noting that Concord received no significant above-the-line marketing budget. The $200 million is the harder-sourced figure. Either number is extraordinary for a studio releasing its first game. April 20th, 2023. Sony acquired Firewalk outright from Probably Monsters for an undisclosed sum. Tony Hsu released a statement. SIE has supported our team's vision from the beginning, and with the incredible creative power of the PlayStation Studio ecosystem. The game was called Concord. It was a 5 versus 5 hero shooter. Counting the original concept work from roughly 2016, development had been running for approximately 7 years. May 24, 2023, the PlayStation Showcase. Concord had its public debut. It lasted 51 seconds. A spaceship in hyperspace, a sniper rifle on a table, a retro-futurist aesthetic with rounded edges and bright palettes that nodded toward science fiction properties. Audiences already knew. No gameplay. No characters shown in combat. The internet formed an impression in those 51 seconds, and the impression was that this was something familiar. The comparisons arrived immediately. Guardians of the Galaxy filtered through a corporate committee. The character roster, 16 heroes with distinct silhouettes and written backstories, struck a wide portion of the gaming audience as derivative. The developers had built something they believed in. The audience saw something they had already seen. None of this was necessarily fatal. First impressions for new IPs are routinely wrong. The question was whether the game itself, when players finally got to play it, would change that initial read. A year passed. May 2024. A Sony State of Play presentation, full gameplay, character reveals, and the price. $39.99. An upfront purchase. All 16 heroes included at launch. No separate unlock track. The hero shooter market had been free to play for years. Overwatch 2 was free. Valorant was free. Apex Legends was free. Team Fortress 2 had been free since 2011. Helldivers 2 had launched that February at $40 and earned enormous goodwill. But Helldivers 2 was cooperative, a different space with no direct competitors in its lane. Concord was entering the most crowded segment of multiplayer gaming and asking players to pay at the door while every established alternative kept the door open. Community reaction was immediate and consistent. Not going free to play is going to kill this game captured the dominant sentiment across forums and social media. Firewalk believed the model was defensible. One price. No battle pass. No monetization ladder. They had watched Helldivers 2 validate paid multiplayer that February. They believed the same could work. The data would answer in July. July 12 to 14, 2024, the closed beta. Steam peak, approximately 1,100 concurrent players. July 18 to 21, the open beta, available on Steam and PlayStation 5. Steam peak, 20,388 concurrent players. Day 2, 1,666. Day 3, 1,447. Industry press described those numbers as horrifyingly low for a AAA first-party shooter. The trajectory was visible to anyone looking. Interest peaked on the first day of the free test and declined every day after. The warning was not subtle. It was in the numbers. August 23, 2024. Concord launched on PlayStation 5 and Windows PC. Steam peak on launch day, 697 concurrent players. That number was lower than the open beta. Lower than the closed beta. The retail paid version of the game attracted fewer people than the free tests had. Players who had sampled Concord at no cost had decided, in large numbers, not to buy it. In the first days of release, analysts estimated total sales across both platforms at approximately 25,000 units, roughly 60% on PlayStation 5, 40% on PC. Sony has never released official sales data. At $40 per copy, 25,000 units implies approximately $1 million in gross revenue, against a confirmed investment of at least $200 million. Critics filed their reviews. Metacritic scored the game at 65, aggregated from 24 critic reviews. The user score landed at 2.1, driven significantly by review bombing. The critical consensus was consistent in its shape. The moment-to-moment gameplay functioned well. The shooting was polished. The maps were competently designed. The problems were elsewhere, in the visual identity, in the roster appeal, in the question players kept asking about why this game, at $40, instead of the free alternatives they already knew. Concord has the bones of a fun multiplayer game, one summary noted, but it's missing the meat. A minority of critics made a genuine case for what Firewalk had built. Tight, polished gameplay drives its diverse cast along a number of memorable maps, with multiplayer gameplay stripped of annoyance and packed with fun. That review existed. It captured something true. It did not change the trajectory. August 25. Steam peak, 402 players, a 42% decline in 2 days. A hero shooter without players cannot function. Matchmaking degrades. Lobbies fill slowly. The competitive experience the developers built for. Fast, populated, energetic becomes something else at these numbers. The player count was accelerating its own decline. September 3, 2024. 11 days after launch, Sony and Firewalk published an important update on Concord to the PlayStation blog. Sales stopped immediately. Full refunds were promised to all buyers on both platforms. The studio said it would take the game offline and explore options to find a path forward. No specific plan was announced. September 6, 2024. Servers went offline. On that final day, Steam recorded a peak of 110 concurrent players. 14 days. That was the total commercial life of Concord. In the weeks that followed, Sony and Firewalk reviewed their options. A free-to-play pivot was the most discussed path. Open the game at no cost, generate a population, see if the product could find its audience when the price was removed. Kotaku reported that Sony ultimately found no viable path to a relaunch. Ryan Ellis stepped down as game director. He moved into a support role within the studio while leadership worked through the decision. Kotaku reported that Ellis had been too emotional to speak to staff at points in the post-launch all-hands meeting. He had spent 8 years on this project. From the original concept he left Bungie to develop, through the founding of Firewalk, through Sony's acquisition, through launch and collapse. His public statement when the shutdown was announced was brief. It didn't land the way we'd intended. October 29, 2024. Herman Hulst, CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment, published a statement to the PlayStation blog. After much thought, we have determined the best path forward is to permanently sunset the game and close the studio. The same day, Sony announced the simultaneous closure of Neon Koi, its mobile gaming studio. 172 Firewalk employees, 38 Neon Koi employees, 210 jobs total, confirmed by Bloomberg and by a Washington State Warnock filing. Hulst's statement named what had happened. The PvP first-person shooter genre is a competitive space that's continuously evolving, and unfortunately, we did not hit our targets with this title. He added that certain aspects of Concord were exceptional. Then the sentence completed, but others did not land with enough players. Firewalk Studios posted its farewell that same afternoon. The studio that had spent 8 years building a single game ceased to exist 18 months after Sony had purchased it. The IP was not sold. No acquirer was announced. Concord was delisted from the PlayStation Store and Steam. Purchased copies had already been refunded. The game stopped existing commercially, with no relaunch, no port, and no stated plan for preservation. Jim Ryan, the Sony CEO who had presided over the live service strategy that made Concord a flagship investment, retired from his role in September 2024, the same month the shutdown was announced. Hulst inherited the company and the decision both. Here is the final accounting. Firewalk Studios was incorporated in 2018. The concept behind Concord traces to approximately 2016. John Wisniewski, a lead designer at the studio, described development as taking around 8 years. Full production, by the studio's own account, began in 2022. All 3 numbers are defensible depending on what you're counting. None of them change what happened. Sony's confirmed pre-launch investment, at least $200 million. Total estimated revenue, approximately $1 million. The ratio is so lopsided it barely functions as a ratio. It functions as a verdict. 25,000 copies sold, 697 concurrent players on Steam at peak launch, 14 days on sale. The obvious question is how a project proceeds for 8 years, absorbs 9 figures of investment, runs a public beta that peaked below 2,400 players on Steam, and still launches 3 weeks later. The answer is rarely dramatic. It is structural. The people close enough to recognize what the beta numbers meant were the same people who had spent years building the game. The people with the authority to redirect the investment were reading summaries, not queuing for matches. In the gap between those two groups, momentum carried the project forward. Somebody saw 2,388 open beta players on Steam and approved the launch. This is not a story about a bad game. Concord's gameplay worked. The maps were real. The shooting was polished. The bones existed. It is a story about a market that went free to play while a studio spent 8 years crossing a room. By the time Concord reached the door, the genre had moved without it. And the players, the ones the game needed in order to function, had already made their choice in a market full of free alternatives long before launch day. "172 people lost their jobs for that answer. They deserved to hear it sooner. If there's a game you think belongs on this table, something the industry moved past too quickly, something that deserved a better ending, leave it in the comments.